Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today. Here's another one of my military history videos that I rather like doing and would also like it if they'd received a larger following. But let's see how this one goes. This is about the fall of Singapore, which is the biggest and most humiliating military defeat ever suffered by Britain in the history of sort of British military history. So it deserves quite a lot of attention, I think, if only because of that. Now, I've recently finished reading a book which I actually read twice, and it's about the fall of Singapore, but the author's taken a slightly different approach to things. Rather than look at the real big ticket issues, which are the ones that tend to be covered in any military history, even ones that purport to be exhaustive, rather than concentrating on those big things, the author has delved into really the minutiae, the micro details, and and gives a lot of time to them. The book's nearly 700 pages long, and the type is quite small, to give you an idea. It's something of a tome, and this is the bigger issues are actually covered in a paragraph, whereas the micro details of who said what, who did what happened here or there, and so on, is covered in exhaustive detail, and it gives a completely different picture, I think, or a somewhat different picture to what happened in Singapore. Now I'll just give a bit of a backstory. It's the end of 1941, it's heading into 1942, and the Japanese are on the march. Now the Japanese army's in China, and they've been there for some years, and the Americans are putting trade embargoes on Japan for essential raw materials such as oil and so on. So the Japanese do the calculus that while Britain and France and so on are tied up by Germany in the war in Europe, what they're going to do is they'll make a quick lunge for control of that part of the Asia Pacific, the Western Asia Pacific, and they'll take control of that, knock out the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, so they can then cut a deal with the Americans. Say, look, we control this area now, so you can either give us the stuff we want, the oil, or we'll keep this area, but you don't want the aggravation of going to war, and nor do we really. So now the Japanese were pretty confident they could cut a deal, and it didn't turn out that way. Instead, the outraged Americans declared war, and of course that ended the Pacific War in World War II. Now the British had considerable holdings around the Asia Pacific region, and the Malaya, or Malaya Peninsula as it was called then, where Singapore Island is at the southern tip of that. The Malaya Peninsula was a big thing for the British, rubber and all sorts of stuff they were getting from there. Plus it was a great location for the trading routes around that Southeast Asian region. So the British had put some time and effort, maybe not well spent with hindsight, but put quite a bit of time and effort into being able to defend that area should war break out. Now the Malay Peninsula, today it's called Malaysia by the way, but the Malay Peninsula back then is, I'm just sort of giving it some rough geographic positioning. It's south of China, it's east of Vietnam, and it's north of Australia, so that's the region it's in. Now, why was this defeat so humiliating, this defeat of the British? Because it took the Japanese not even 3 months to land an army and conquer the entire Malaya Peninsula, overcoming a British force that was 3 times their number. So the British were better equipped, they were more numerous, they should have been prepared at least, and yet they were defeated so quickly and so comprehensively and so totally that even today people can barely work it out when they try and look at, well, how did this happen? So the Japanese landed at the very northern end of the Malayan Peninsula. In fact, some of these landings were in Thailand, which is supposedly a neutral country, and they travelled well over 1,000 miles with their supplies and other bits and pieces and tanks and oil. And they had an army of just under 40,000 men. Most of these men were quite experienced, and if the ones that weren't battle seasoned were quite well trained, so their officers were quite good. So it was quite a cohesive, laser-like focused, well planned, well executed. Their logistics were good. Their tactics were good. It was a professional First World Army, and the British had assumed that the quality of the Japanese army was going to be poor or subpar at the very least. So what was the situation of the British forces in Singapore? Now, remember, Britain was hard pressed by Hitler in Europe, so they didn't have endless resources they could spare, but at least the total army, including administration staff and hangers-on and all sorts of things, came to about 135,000, as opposed to the Japanese 40,000. Now, or less than 40,000. Now, the actual fighting numbers of troops, in reality, were about 90,000 all up, and some of those troops arrived. Some Australian forces, for example, arrived not long before the whole army surrendered to the Japanese. So the idea that there was 130,000 frontline, British troops or something isn't true. That there, give or take, about 90,000 was the total number of troops, and more than 2/3 of those had either the minimum 6 weeks training. Some had no training at all, and some were had no battle. There was maybe, I don't know, 3,000 or 4,000 were battle experienced, properly battle experienced, and the officers that were in charge were, in my view at least, they were just a bunch of socialites, bureaucrats, pen pushers, and they weren't the hardened, skilled, well-trained officers that the Japanese army had. So there was a number of handicaps there. So even though they outnumbered the Japanese initially by 3-1, they still couldn't field large numbers of experienced battle-seasoned troops. So there was a minority of those. Again, really a handful at the end of the day. The ones that had the 13-week basic training still would have been maybe 10,000. So we're not looking at high-quality soldiers or officers here at all. And it goes to show the difference between what a professional, well-trained, well-organised, well-led army can achieve against a much larger army that's by contrast quite poorly trained and quite poorly led. Nonetheless, there were enough people there to do enough soldiers that had the will and the determination being there. They could have defeated the Japanese. Came close to doing it, by the way, in the overall scheme of things. The Japanese were close to running out of supplies, and if the British had been made a determined attack at that point, they could have won and defeated the Japanese. But nonetheless, let's go over. They ended up surrendering in February to the Japanese, so February 1942. So let's have a look at this now. This history of going through the micro details, even though again it kind of almost glosses over the big ticket stuff. Under the assumption, well, we know about that already. Let's look at let's get into the weeds and look at the details. And when you see that, you see a quite a different picture. For example, there's a section of the battlefront that's held by the Indian regiment. Now the Indians, a number of this regiment has been infiltrated by a number of Indian independence activists. Why should we fight for the white man? The Japanese will give us our liberty, and this and that, and that. So why don't we just go over to the Japanese? So 500 Indian soldiers just down tools and walked across, went to the Japanese, said, "Well, we'll fight on your side, or at the very least we won't." So that opens up a gap in the front. That's the battlefront. That opens up a gap that's over 1 kilometre wide. The British don't realise this straight away, and then it takes a few hours to get other troops to fill the gap. By that time, the Japanese have started to move through it, which means that it's outflanking other units, which then have to fall back. Then no one knows, well, why are we falling back? But then the officers don't want to say, well, all those Indians just went across to the other side, because that would be tough for morale, so they try not to say anything. The troops are bewildered, what's going on here? Why is this happening? Because they have to retreat so quickly, they've got to leave key weapons and ammunition behind, and then so what begins with something like 500 guys, Indians in this case, going across. Thousands ended up going across to the Japanese, by the way. That creates a situation where the battlefront begins to collapse and disintegrate. People are going off in all directions. Officers and no one really knows what's happening or why it's happening. There's suddenly the orders on what to do stop. So again, chaos ensues, and these sorts of things were, you might say, well, it's only 500 guys, so what? but if you're an activist, encouraging these guys to cross, and you're in contact with the Japanese officers that are obviously exhorting you to do this, then the Japanese are ready to exploit this. They've got the troops sort of ready to exploit this opportunity, and so it happens. Now this also suggests that the British intelligence officers were of very poor quality, or there weren't enough of them, or they weren't looking at this. This independence activism was all over India at the time. So the idea that the British were unaware of it, didn't know about it. So this is a serious oversight. Why would you put people that are almost mutinous, the Indians in this case, why would you put people that are in a mutinous condition, why would you put them at the battlefront, at a key sector? Why would you do that? I mean, you wouldn't, would you? Wouldn't you give them other tasks, less important tasks to do? Wouldn't you make sure that if they were at the battlefront that they were interspersed with loyal troops and so on? So a lot of oversights and things like that. Now it ended up thousands of Indians either refused to fight or went over to the Japanese. Some did fight, by the way, but many others didn't. Thousands again crossed over. Now, was a lot of talk about the lack of discipline with the Australian troops in Singapore, and there was a lot of witnesses that claimed that the Australians were deserting the battlefront and just wandering around Singapore City, even when the Japanese were only miles away. That seems a bit odd. If you know the enemy that's going to kill you or imprison you is only a few miles away, why would you wander around drunk, staggering around, refusing to fight? I'm not sure I buy any of that. But some of it must be true. There are just too many witnesses attesting to it. Now, Australians soldiers have a reputation as tough and determined fighters. So this is not the same as, the reputation, be it deserved or not, is inconsistent with the behaviour that apparently or allegedly happened in Singapore. So there are other factors here. Now let's have a look at this. The Australian troops that are being diverted to Singapore didn't want to be there. They wanted to be protecting protecting Australia and their families and their land and their homes in Australia. They didn't want to be there. Some had almost no training. In fact, the Australian government had preferred, the less trained and experienced the soldiers were, the more likely they were to send to Singapore. The Australian government was, understandably by the way, holding back the more experienced troops, even the ones that had completed basic training. So they were grabbing people of lower quality, poorer attitude, no training, and sending them off to Singapore. And these people were there were experienced Australian troops, by the way, who'd fought in, say, Crete and places like that, in Egypt, and they were being sent there. But the training of the organisation, the leadership was poor. Many of them found that their their rifles and ammunition didn't work, didn't fit. There was no air cover of substance. They were limited in the amount of what they could do with the artillery, and there were conflicting orders that were coming from their local officers and the main army command. The Australians were also outraged that the local soldiers, the local Chinese soldiers, or maybe their local Chinese police that had been sort of dragooned into being soldiers, they would, the first sight of shots being fired, and they would just abandon the line. They were employed then to bring up supplies, and this wasn't done. So the Australians would say, well, why should we fight for Singapore if the locals don't care about it? I want to go back to Australia and fight for my country, and what are we doing here? And my rifle doesn't work. Look at this ammunition. Its manufacturer's faulty. The bullets won't fire. They get jammed in the gun, and so there are all sorts of complaints. There were an insufficient number of machine guns, and so on. Now, some of the officers, the junior officers, say up to major and colonel, that sort of thing, or lieutenant colonel at least in the Australian forces, weren't necessarily up to the job, and they had very basic training. If you had some sort of advanced education, anything, you were considered to be officer material, even though these people didn't really know what they were doing. Well, some did. And so when when a landing of the Japanese troops was obvious on a certain beach or whatever, the Australian front line was 500 metres away from where the Japanese were going to land, and with no open field of fire, so they couldn't. So when the Japanese were landing, they were landing frequently unopposed. Such were the poor dispositions of the troops. Now we're talking about small numbers here. So the Japanese landed on a small front. So 1,000 soldiers with machine guns and working rifles and so on, could have easily stopped that landing. A bit of artillery and so on, but it wasn't done. Instead, the troop disposition was 500 yards back. Why weren't these things picked up by the more senior officers? So this level of the micro breakdown of the operations and functions, dispositions and placements of troops, where the supply dumps were, in some cases the troops would be in the right place, but their supply dump was miles away. And given that the Chinese, logistics people had abandoned the battlefield, then they work out, well, where's our supply dump? Oh, I don't know. Ching Wong knows where it is, but I don't know. And so they'd wander around looking for their supply dump. The senior officers didn't know where it was, and this sort of silly fiasco level confusion was everywhere, and contributed mightily to the breakdown of the cohesion and just an effective fighting force. Now the Japanese didn't make many mistakes, but because they were able to act and move almost unopposed in every key move they made, their victories and their achievements looked like wow, there's a wow factor. But really it wasn't that. It was just that the ineptitude that they faced was so incredible that their actions, again, being unopposed. So when they landed, on Singapore Island, coming down from the Malay Peninsula, this is just the final battles are sort of going. They had the smaller sort of rubber boats or smaller boats, and they were crossing the fairly narrow channel really that separates the Malay Peninsula from Singapore Island, and they were crossing this in boats, and they could have. This is sort of, I don't know, 8-9 o'clock at night, I think, on the first wave. They could easily have been stopped at the beach. They easily could have been, shot up in the water before they even got to the beach if there'd been proper organisation and proper surveillance and so on. But the Japanese actually launched their boats and were halfway across before surveillance even picked up that there's anything going on. So again, you know that the enemy's there. You know that they're going to cross. You know that you've seen the activity during daytime on the other. You know all this, yet still you don't have the proper surveillance in place. I mean, that's incredible. I mean, the negligence is just off the charts here. So these little things were what was going on, and the book, this history, covers these things in detail. And when you see the amount of micro stuff-ups, micro-level mistakes, silly fiasco-type mistakes, and oversights and negligence, then you can see how a force this big was defeated by a much smaller force, albeit a more professional army, better-led army it was. The other mistakes, or among many, I mean, there's just too many to name. Mistakes was there was no proper provision made for control of the water supply, so that the Japanese were able to just penetrate the front line, the British front line, almost anywhere, and it would create a widespread panic where they'd all fall back to then create another defensive line, which the Japanese would then penetrate or outflank, and on it went. And there just weren't the proper provisions made for having a cohesive front line, a cohesive command. Now, a lot of because he was the senior officer on the spot, General Percival. Now, General Percival was really a bureaucrat. He wasn't a wartime battlefield leader. He had seen some action in the First World War, but he was effectively a bureaucrat. And he was well thought of by other bureaucrats in London, and so he got the gig not because he was an inspiring leader or a great military thinker or anything like that, simply because he was a well-liked bureaucrat who was liked by other bureaucrats, and then he was put in that position. Now the British knew the Japanese, or very high probability they would be fighting the Japanese would attack. Pretty much everything was known. The likely landing spots where the Japanese would land, this was known. The likely routes and paths they'd take. The Japanese were much better at penetrating the jungle than the British thought, so that was something that they weren't prepared for. But in every other sense, they knew where the Japanese were coming and that they probably would come, and they knew the whole thing. Now, the Japanese were able to land an army with all supplies and bits and pieces of just a little bit under 40,000 men that again had to travel over 1,000 miles, and they were able to do this in an impressive logistical feat while fighting an opposing army, and they were able to cover this distance and win the entire campaign in 10 weeks, 11 weeks, all up. I mean, that's an astonishing achievement, but it's only because they were facing a completely and utterly incompetent foe. Now, to sort of take a wider angle view, the Japanese had superiority in the air that the British couldn't offer much resistance in the air, so the Japanese had air superiority, which it was nice to have, but it wasn't decisive. They still could have been defeated had the effort been determined. But the Japanese were able to outflank the British numerous times, going around the jungle tracks in bicycles and things like that. Now, you'd think you'd learn these things pretty quickly. We in this defence position we have to do this, that, and so on, because they'll just outflank us coming through the jungle. But instead they made the same mistake again, the British, again and again and again, falling for the same thing again and again. I mean, that's not incompetence. What do you even call that? Madness, insanity? I don't know. And it's almost maddening to see such levels of continuous ineptitude, continuous incompetence, continuous faulty decision making. And you look at the attitude of the people, even as the Japanese were advancing down the Malay Peninsula towards Singapore, almost, not unopposed, but almost unopposed in reality. The opposition was so ineffective that they were able to just simply walk their way through. But the bureaucracy and the government in Singapore had the view that somehow it was far, far away and nothing would happen to them. And so the administration and the bureaucracy and so on, they were still taking the view that it was just somehow far away. They were living in some alternative reality where they didn't need to worry about anything. They didn't. No. We don't have to turn the lights out to face the Japanese. But we don't need to do any of that. Look, everything will be fine. And there were so many questions, so many statements about, well, morale will be affected if we start building defence positions. Morale will be affected, and we can't have that. Now, morale is an issue. I do understand that, but the reality was that you've got an opposing army moving fast, and you're not able to stop them. There's no sign you'll be able to stop them. So you better start making preparations. That's the sober and sensible thing to do. Instead, they didn't. They left it till the last minute, and then built very ineffective. Even when some of the Japanese troops were landing on Singapore Island, there were no trenches dug or no breastworks, earthworks put up. There was nothing. So the Japanese just again strolled through, even though there were 100,000 odd troops on Singapore Island, British troops, and at that stage about 31,000 Japanese troops. But the Japanese still just strolled through almost at will, and the opposition was so ineffective that it was beyond pathetic. But these are this is the thing. So there were many contributing factors to the disaster at Singapore, and the humiliation was just off the charts. But the means to defeat the Japanese was always there. They just couldn't get it together. They were just too useless, incompetent, lazy, slothful. Now the Australian the deserters, you have a lot of Indian deserters going, and not only deserting but going over to the Japanese. That was certainly not the essential, but a significant factor nonetheless. The Australians that were deserting, and they weren't deserting far. It's not like they were deserting to a million miles away. They were just going maybe 10 or 15 miles tops to the docks in Singapore, looking for a ship to take them back to Australia, where they did want to fight, but not in Singapore. So, but when the Australians were deserting, and they were in substantial numbers, depending on what was going on. But when they deserted, I'm not even sure I'd call it desertion. When they thought, screw this, these people are useless. Well, nothing's going to be achieved here. I might as well go back to Australia and fight there. But bear in mind too, the Japanese have landed in New Guinea at this point, which is the island to the north of Australia. They landed in New Guinea, and the panic in Australia is very real. That the Japanese will be in Australia any minute now. And so you can understand how the Australian soldiers, why am I here? I need to be back in Australia. And so they weren't deserting as in, I don't want to fight. They were, I want to go back to Australia in case the Japanese go there. But nonetheless, so now the soldiers that were deserting the front line, or just leaving the front line, they weren't the top quality, disciplined, well-trained soldiers. So their loss wasn't as acute as it might have been had the soldiers been. Nonetheless, the effect on morale generally was had taken on. The Japanese couldn't be beaten. So they'd gone from thinking the Japanese are these blind, sort of slant-eyed, bandy-legged midgets to we can't beat these guys. They've got it all over us. And so that's an incredible turnaround in attitude and outlook and morale. So what this author's done in this book is bring to light and getting into the weeds of it all, has brought to light these micro details, and just on a one-off basis they're not really hugely relevant, but in aggregation, when across your entire battlefront you've got not only a high number of desertions, troops crossing over to the enemy, a communication structure that's dysfunctional, an intelligence operation that's next to useless, generals bickering, and no real battlefield general that's in charge. There's some senior officers there, but they're at loggerheads. One's a passive bureaucrat. The other one's one that only believes in certain battlefield strategies that aren't really applicable in a jungle situation, and so on. So you're looking at all this, and it's just mind-boggling that none of these people seem to have come to grips with the reality of what's going on. Some of the minutes from some of the meetings are such, and you think they could be in another universe. They're not talking about any reality that's on the ground in front of them. They're theorising about things that don't exist, problems that aren't there. They're inventing problems rather than dealing with the problems that are really in front of them, such as fighting the enemy. And there's a critical thing. Just a couple of days before the surrender, the General Percival, the senior officer, holds a meeting with the senior officers, and again he's behaving like a bureaucrat at this meeting, not a general. And he says, look, I'm paraphrasing here, he says, look, we've either got to surrender because we're running out of supplies, and the water supply is running low. We either need to surrender, or we need to do everything we can to counterattack and at least get back control of the water reservoirs in the centre of Singapore Island. So Now, at least as the history's recorded, the meeting fell silent. A few people said that a few of the officers, senior officers, said, "Well, the counterattack's going to be really tough. Morale's poor, and I'm not sure that would really work. It'll be a lot of casualties." And then the meeting fell silent. No one, certainly as the history records it, no one said, "Well, let's surrender." They said, given that General Percival, we either counterattack or surrender, they said their counterattack would be fraught with challenges and difficulties. Well, of course it's going to be fraught. I mean, it's a fucking military operation. Of course it's going to be fraught, face challenges. That's what military operations are, challenges. But not certainly as it's recorded, not a single officer was advocated for the counterattack. Now, they all knew that the option was surrendering to the Japanese, a humiliation of astronomical, yet none of them seemed to discount that. You'd think there would have been an attitude, well, surrender's just out of the question. Given the orders were, fight to the death and everything, but instead, why don't we surrender? Now, how many of these people were loyal British subjects? How many of them were really, there to uphold the honour of the Empire and the British Army and this and that? Well, none, it would seem. So if that's the attitude that the officers had, that they were just simply carrying out administrative tasks rather than leading an army to victory, then you can see where the genesis of final defeat really was. Now, in the aftermath of the surrender, and even in the final sort of days, really, the government in Britain and elsewhere was very mindful of the propaganda value of putting out the facts. They didn't want the issue of the Indians, the mutinous Indians abandoning the front line and walking over to the Japanese. They didn't want that broadcast. They wanted to keep that under wraps. They were concerned, not unreasonably by the way, they were concerned today that might encourage other Indians to be mutinous and make the Indian subcontinent ungovernable or require lots of troops to keep it from disintegrating. So they didn't want that. And there were still loyal sections, by the way. Some of the Gurkhas and this sort of thing were still loyal soldiers to the British military cause. So it wasn't like every Indian was being mutinous, far from it. Then the situation where the Australian government was already very reluctant to, bearing in mind the Japanese threat, was very reluctant to give any troops to Britain, especially in the Middle East and Egypt, and also give any more troops. No, you've got enough. We need troops to defend Australia, which is reasonable enough, by the way. So the idea of Australian troops deserting and the ill discipline and the troops, soldiers fighting with officers, these sorts of things, which were supposedly going on in Singapore, and which had made a significant contribution to things collapsing. This was wanted to be swept under the carpet. No, we don't want to talk about that. We don't want to piss off the Australian government. We don't want to give the impression to the enemy that the Commonwealth and the Empire is falling to pieces. We're all loggerheads, so we need to just not talk about this. And the censors just cut it all out of the wartime correspondence. When the Australian journalists got back to Australia, some of them managed to get out before the surrender, and they'd seen all this firsthand on the street. They weren't allowed to comment on it. The Australian government wanted censored as well, for obvious reasons. So in the end, a lot of these things weren't talked about, which meant that the blame for the surrender and the defeat, the proportion of it fell more and more onto the shoulders of General Percival. Not that he wasn't to blame, he was. I mean, he was the wrong man for that job. When he had officers around him that were giving him good quality advice, he ignored it. And towards the end there, he stopped being a leader, general leader. Instead, again, was acted like some sort of a chairman of the board, holding meetings of the directors. And so, well, I'll abide by the majority decision rather than making the decisions. Now, as it turned out, the Japanese were really had just about run out of all supplies. Bullets for guns, shells for the artillery. The air support had been largely withdrawn, and they had other things to do. So, had the British made a spirited counterattack, in sort of February 12th, 13th, 14th, around there, they could have defeated the Japanese in detail and comprehensively. It could have been a crushing victory for the British army. But instead, they just tamely surrendered and rolled over for all the wrong reasons. And so that campaign, that Malaya campaign, and General Yamashita and his 38,000 men, that stands out in military history as being one of the greatest military achievements, certainly in modern military warfare and military history. Overcoming an army 3-4 times bigger than his and doing it all in 10 weeks. It's an astonishing accomplishment. But the incompetence, the utter incompetence, and the micro level of endless stuff-ups and mistakes, errors, oversights, slackness, sloth, more than contributed to. But again, when you've got your senior officers saying, "Nah, let's not fight, let's just surrender," when that's the attitude of them, then that attitude must have pervaded down to the lower ranks and the lower, more junior officers, and that, I would argue, was the cause of the defeat. You've been with Tacitus today, and thank you for listening.